afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Vital Dissent. I am your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This is episode 261. Show notes may be found at vitaldissent.com/261. And on the line, I have for the first time on this show, Brandan Buck. How's it going, Brandan?
Doing great. Still contending with that lawnmower. I think he just passed. So, doing wonderful, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, really glad to have you here. I know you're a PhD candidate in history, I believe. You've written for the Libertarian Institute and for Responsible Statecraft, and I think some other outlets. But since this is your first time on the show, do you just want to introduce yourself and your work to the audience?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm a PhD candidate in history at George Mason University, where I am currently painfully working on a dissertation on the non-interventionist right from the 1890s all the way up through the early 1990s with the fall of the wall. Like I said, I do a little bit of writing on the side, mainly concerning, the intersection of domestic and foreign politics, particularly as it is associated with conservatism and libertarianism.
I should have worn my Scalia Law School polo that I have that went to a judicial training, so I didn't actually go to Scalia Law School, but when I was there, I picked up a polo, but I should have worn that for this interview. Well, that's a very interesting topic, and I think it's incredibly important. I mean, especially myself being the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute and his book, Reclaiming the American Right, and just tracing that lineage of the non-interventionist right back to the roots. It seems like Justin draws a direct, if you do a family tree, a lineage right from the Rothbardians back to people like Garrett Garrett and Ralph Raico, I think. I mean, I'm getting my timeline a bit mixed up because I'm not an expert, but what, I guess just to start off, what really interested you in this topic?
Well, actually, I have his book right here, and I had read some work for my comps. A book called Across of Iron by a historian with the last name of Hogan, and in it he chronicles the origins of the national security state. And in that book, the chief roadblock to Truman and then to Eisenhower is the right wing of the GOP. And I knew about Rothbard and the paleo strategy and Pat Buchanan, so I just was curious, like, what happens in the middle? All right, like, where do these ideas go? After Korea, because that's the typical academic and also libertarian consensus that with the Bricker Amendment in the mid 50s, that isolationism dies off, and so that was my central research question: is where does it go? And then very quickly, when you look at Congress and also conservative media outside of the orbit of national review, you realize it doesn't really go anywhere. That critical strains of non-interventionist thinking that had become considered right-wing, like they become particularized as a result of World War II and the early Cold War, they linger on all the way through the 60s into Vietnam, and then find a lifeboat in the form of libertarianism. And you mentioned Raimondo, and one of the things I think when it comes to this topic is that the people who wrote the first draft of this, it was Murray Rothbard, it was Liggio, it was Carl Hess, and they are, and they sought to recapture their particular lineage of non-interventionism back to Garrett Garrett and back to John T. Flynn, the more liberal aspects of the old right, because the old right was a coalition, of disaffected liberals who leave the Democrats, more sort of free market people, a smattering of progressives, and it's from them that you really get the hardcore non-interventionism. But also there was a more sort of small C conservative wing of the old right, people like Herbert Hoover, those in his orbit, a man named Bonner Fellers, who came to fame as a member of Douglas MacArthur's staff. And these people were more sort of Hamiltonians, more pro-tariff, and they stay in conservative politics long after that mid-50s window, and they bring with them this disdain for foreign aid, this desire to remain out of NATO. They continued to advocate for withdrawal of U.S. troops from Western Europe. There was some unilateralism that they wanted to maintain in the Pacific, but even there, like the flavor of their containment policy was considerably different than that of the liberal internationalist consensus that was emerging. And so really what they're offering is a version of a kind of America, like a kind of fortress America for the Cold War. And then it becomes a question, well, what happens to them? Why can't their ideas persist within the party? So that's the very long elevator pitch for my research.
No, I think it's great too, because I mean, to have an understanding of how these ideas have evolved throughout time. I mean, and I've revived like my newsletter that I'm doing at libertyweekly.club. Like I haven't changed the URL, but I'm trying with that newsletter to go through and teach people how I approach these topics of dark history. And one of the biggest themes is context is key, right? And so in this interview, we're going to get into it, but the context being that, well, everyone thinks that their period of time is unique and that we're seeing things that are happening for the first time, and in a way it's a bit alarming, but at the same time, understanding the context of how these ideas were presented in the past, who were presenting them, and what the response to those ideas were, hopefully we can learn a little bit from it. And I think that's, that context is what you're providing and what you provide in these pieces that we're going to be talking about here today. So I guess maybe we want to shatter people's worldviews or disappoint them in a way and say, well, things that are happening right now in Ukraine, is this unique to our history? Have we ever seen this before?
Well, it rhymes, right? I would. There are certainly patterns that have repeated, and I think it's more that the old consensus has broken down more than we've seen like a complete rehash of the past. And that consensus is this liberal internationalism that had maintained, a hegemonic grip on elite political opinion from the start of the Cold War all the way up through the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then got a shot in the arm with the war on terror, right? Because if you think about the way that the war on terror was sold, it was very much as the Cold War was sold and as the Second World War, right? Even the phrase Islamofascist, the kind of nonsense term. But now that that's over, I think we're seeing a return to a ideological spectrum on foreign policy that's far more like pre-World War II and even then like the sort of late 30s, where we have a strongly interventionist and internationalist Democratic Party with a very, very tiny rump of progressives and liberals outside of that consensus, and then a Republican elite that is more or less in line with that worldview, although with a more unilateralist bent, and then a small but vocal dissent within the right, both from populists and also what we would now call libertarians, what we used to call liberals. So in that sense, it has, and we are seeing a repeat, mainly, but just because that consensus had broken down, and it's not. There's nothing set in stone. There's nothing in the stars that says that we need to have a right that thinks this about foreign policy and the left that thinks this about foreign policy. For most of American history, foreign policy was sectional. So you had a northern political class that had a particular point of view, a southern political class that had a particular point of view, and then a midwestern class that had a particular point of view. But those old sectional viewpoints broke down as America nationalizes at the end of World War II in both its politics and its culture. And so now we're seeing a reversion to that, but it's more murky. It's more urban, rural, southern, a southerner with populist ideologies is going to think about America and the world far more like a midwesterner with populist leanings or libertarian ideologies. So in one way we have like reverted back to a previous era, but in another we haven't, because there's no sectional political basis to get these like ideas going, right? Because now you have a completely dispersed, opposition or resistance that has a very difficult way to exert its influence on the national level.
I'm always kind of fascinated by the populist right and the emergence of this populist right, and continually frustrated with how they can be good on important issues, admittedly so, like Ukraine, and you have people like Matt Gaetz introducing some very important legislation that I commend him for. But at the same time, there always seems to be this hawkish China, like the China hawkish bent to it, that we need to conserve our power and strength so that we can confront China in the South Pacific. And where does that, I don't know what your read on it is, but where does that come from? Because it just seems like it's coming from a different place than where libertarians would. But at the same time, the populist bent does seem, in a way, kind of paleo. The specter of America First, and I know we're going to talk about that too. But what do you think about that?
So the right in America, broadly defined, is what the left isn't, right? It's always been coalitional, and so I think this Asia First obsession with China is something that has existed within conservative thinking all the way back to McKinley in the 1890s. The Democrats have traditionally been the party of the Atlantic, and the Republicans the Pacific. And so I think if you wind the clock all the way back to the foundation of the old right, there was a section of the old right that wanted American power in the Pacific for purposes of economics and the open door to China and all that. And it had taken various forms. Sometimes it had been more militaristic, other times less. So I think it's that, plus it's coupled with just generations of inertia on the issue of militarism more broadly. I think while the right has gotten better on, and by the right I mean the sort of non-libertarian right, has gotten better on issues of intervention, they're still very much wrapped up in the flag when it comes to past military, past glories. Like if you think even when Trump was at his rhetorical best, and I use that word advisedly, he couched his non-intervention with a mantra of strength, right? We so intervene now that we're weak, and we need to conserve our strength so we can be mighty. And it's not like a market-oriented version of foreign relations. It is a kind of power politics. That being said, though, it's less ideological, right? There's not. I guess you could argue otherwise, but it seems to me that there's less of this belief that we need to conquer China and turn China into America, right? This is more like a kind of realpolitik vision for America and the world. So in that sense, it is considerably different from the liberal consensus. And of course, Mexico is now, I guess, every 2 to 4 years, there are these absurd notions about going to war in Mexico over drugs,
right?
Or immigration or what have you. So it's chaos. It'll probably continue to be chaos. And this is one of those things where I think, unfortunately, history is not very useful, because we don't know what's going to come next, because there's not, despite this autocracies versus democracies language, there's not a strong ideological bent to either America's relationship with Russia or China that can police the parties back into some kind of consensus.
So I think in turning to the work that you've done in these articles that we're going to discuss here, I think it's probably best to take them in chronological order. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think that starts with Woodrow Wilson and your Responsible Statecraft article that you just came out with. So I'll put it on screen here. The headline is "Feeling Manipulated: How Uncle Sam Perfected the Information State. The Twitter files are just the latest in 100 years of the government imposing its will through covert media and intimidation." So what was what's kind of the thesis? I mean, I kind of alluded to it here, but what's your thesis with this piece?
Well, it's just that ever since America has had a desire to maintain a aggressive or assertive presence in the world, at least going back to Woodrow Wilson, there has been a marriage of information and foreign policy. That, of course, in these circles, everyone loves Woodrow Wilson, right? He's everyone's most hated president, and for good reason. And his early model was to create a patriotic fervor, to get America involved in the war first as a supplier to the Allies, and then later on as a belligerent. So that required active measures. There was still significant opposition to America's involvement in the world, particularly in certain pockets of the country for both political and ethnic reasons. And so that America had to be made whole in order to execute the federal government's policies. And so to do that, he created what was called the Committee for Public Information, which was kind of PR campaign. But even more than that, they were active in censorship through the post office of various sort of dissident ideas. And of course, we have the Sedition Act, which was used against people who spoke out against the war. I think it was something like 1,600 Americans were arrested. And this was the heaviest iteration of what has been called the information state. But later iterations of it, first through World War II, and then through the Cold War, and then now have become less heavy-handed, but in some ways more pernicious. Roosevelt realized that, like World War I, the government had to sell America on the war, because even in the last days of American neutrality, while Americans a majority of Americans wanted to support the Allies, they were very much against, on the whole, going into the war actively. So, in order to sell Americans first on aid and then on the war, Roosevelt and his administration realized they had to do similar to Wilson. But the FDR was much more hesitant about using the sort of heavy hand like his predecessor did. So even though George Creel, who was still alive at the time, counseled Roosevelt to bring back the CPI, he declined and instead decided to work through intermediaries, both members of the friendly press, as well as the FBI working behind the scenes, and also British intelligence. And so these folks did much of the same that was done during World War I, just with a much more hidden hand, actively working against non-interventionists in the press, amplifying the more tenuous and nefarious connections to both foreign and domestic actors, and pumping what we would call propaganda into the American sphere. And then there were iterations of this that echoed through the Cold War. And then when much of this finally came to light in the 1970s with the Church and Pike commissions, while there was a sense of outrage, this outrage did not last and did not really manifest into real reforms, because by this point, the American press, the American corporate press, was still in agreement with the broad strokes of American foreign policy, even in the wake of the anguish of Vietnam. So there was not this desire to sort of clean house in the way that the moment would have demanded. And then now in the present, we're in an even more we're an even softer yet more pernicious version of that, where you have tech companies and still the corporate press actively colluding with the government to prop up messages that it wants and to suppress messages that it doesn't.
One thing that I find the most compelling, when we discuss stories like this, or history like this rather, is to focus on individual cases. And I know that one of your articles, I don't think it's this one, but one of your articles references Gerald Nye and the Nye Commission. Well, at least I guess before he came out with the whole Merchants of Death thing, post World War II. But are there any specific human stories that you came across in your research?
So the one that sort of jarred me the most, and this will be a sort of segue into one of the other pieces,
Sure.
was the one about the FBI spying, was, so there was a historian named Douglas Charles, I think. I hope I got that right. And it's not the other way around. But he's the one that did the hard work of getting the Freedom of Information Act requests about the FBI and their role in spying on the America First Committee. And all of those records are available. You can go on archive.org. I have it linked in one of the articles that I wrote. And so seeing individual Americans willingly spying on their neighbors and doing so with zeal was really shocking to me. Especially there were I highlighted some of the darker correspondence in that piece when people were there, fantasizing about sending their America First neighbors into concentration camps or executing them. I mean, this is disturbing behavior, and this is the kind of thing that Americans are supposed to not engage in. And especially at the time, right? America's supposed to be fighting fascism, but the federal government, in its effort to quash fascism, ends up indulging in some people's sort of darkest fantasies. And so seeing that, it makes you wonder about this relationship between the state and individuals when they create incentives. Even though the FBI could not find any actionable information about the America First Committee, because there was no actionable legal information about the America First Committee. They were not in cahoots with the Nazis. There was no spy ring that was pulling the strings of American non-interventionists. Nevertheless, as I argue in that piece and as other historians that were arguing, including Charles, just the mere act of surveillance helps to create the scare amongst the people, what's been called the Brown Scare by other historians. That people writing to the FBI and then getting this sort of positive feedback from them saying, "Good job, keep it up." It helps to sort of maintain this environment of fear, and it's thankfully it didn't get any worse than that. But this is the kind of Stasi behavior, and in Eastern Europe, right? You create incentives, and then you reward people for responding to them. So that was quite dark. Hence why I decided to sort of write the article, because certain aspects of human nature don't change, and I think this is one of them.
Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldissent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldissent.com/stitchfix. You can also get Vital Dissent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Dissent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldissent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel. And I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldissent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at @PatMcFarland_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. Yeah, I think just as a segue, you mentioned the Stasi, and there's that movie, The Lives of Others. I don't know if you've seen it. Very kind of...
love that movie.
It's a great movie, but you see, you do see the terror and the horrors of the snitching culture, the surveillance state, and kind of where it leads in a real human interest story. And I'm not sure just offhand if that's if it's based on real events. It would make sense if it was. But everything portrayed in the movie was actually happening at the time. But for those of you who are not familiar, it's East German. There's an East German dissident, and he's like a playwright, and he's suspected of behavior that's against the party, and he actually is guilty of it. He wrote a letter to be published in the West, and the only way that he was really saved, because he was under surveillance, but the only way he was really saved is that there was a lonely Stasi officer who was tasked with surveilling him, who actually felt bad for him and actively kind of protected him. It doesn't end happily per se, but yeah, that kind of behavior is shocking to see happening in the United States in history. That the snitch culture, and as just tangentially, there's so many things that I can think of where, like the eugenics movement starting in the United States and in England, which ironically, and then moving to Germany, where they take up our ideas and those kind of things. I've done some pieces in my hometown. There was this place they called the Northern Center, and it's where kind of in the eugenics, the progressive era, they would take people who were engaging in behavior like dancing in saloons, and women who were loose, and send them to these facilities to be sterilized and keep them there. And so the kind of the mythos that, yeah, we are unique in the world, that we don't commit these authoritarian behaviors like other countries do, is just that. It's a myth. And especially for behavior that's relevant today, like this non-interventionist idea, and being labeled, at best, a Putin sympathizer, or at worst, an actual Russian agent. And so there's a lot of things that I think we can learn from the America First Committee. And I don't know if you want to take it from there and just kind of tell us what that was, and how, the demonization of them really kind of started and led to this surveillance.
Yeah, so the American First Committee started out as a student organization. So that's what a lot of folks don't realize. They started out at Yale. Like a lot of young people on the eve of World War II, they were really concerned about going off to fight because they don't want to die. It's a pretty old story in American history, one that's repeated, especially in the 1960s. But so they started out as a student organization. I think the person's name was Douglas Stewart Jr. He was the scion of the Quaker Oats. I believe it was the Quaker Oats fortune. So he was originally from the Midwest. And once the organization becomes sort of too large to merely be a student group, it moves to the Midwest, in which it becomes sort of more associated with, I guess you could say, small c conservative business interests in the Midwest. It was headed by a man named General Robert E. Wood. He was on the board of Sears and Roebuck, and much of the early financing and organizing was done by the conservative business interests in the Midwest, because these business interests historically had been associated with non-intervention. They really believed more in tariffs, and they saw their economic interests being more regional than international. But also in the Midwest, there was a strong progressive tradition against non-intervention, going all the way back to the to the Philippines and the brutal occupation and pacification that archipelago by the U.S. government. That came to a head during World War One, when again the Midwest was the most actively non-interventionist region within the United States. Some people chalk that up to the preponderance of German immigrants as well as Irish immigrants. I think those arguments are overstated. I think it has to do more with politics, especially considering that these ideas had long predated World War One. A lot. Go ahead.
Sorry, as a Yankee German myself, I kind of bristle at that. I don't bristle at it. I just mean it's. I like to think that my ancestors would be more non-interventionist just by the being German itself. But anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's funny you say that, because there's some theories, and this is something I really want to test, is that people at the time, like Howard Buffett, chief figure on the old right, his contention wasn't really that it was just that it was Germans. It's that it was a particular type of Germans that came over to the United States in the mid 19th century who were trying to flee Prussian conscription. That these were religious pacifists. These were people who believed in liberal politics, and so they came to a part of the country that was still being settled, in this Jeffersonian tradition of small landholders. And so they slotted right in there, and their anti-militarist politics really fit in with the Midwest's politics at the time. So it wasn't merely this that they were Germans, is that they were a particular type of Germans with a particular type of politics who came over at a particular time. And and they weren't the only ones that had these sentiments. Like if you looked in the 1890s all the way up to World War I, there was a strong opposition to navalism, to building like a large ocean-going navy. And so all of these various threads, be they ethnic or religious or populist politics, sectional politics, come to a head with the America First Committee. By the late 30s, due to the election of 1938, the Midwest becomes the GOP's conservative bastion. So the polarity of politics within the party is starting to flip. Whereas the Midwest used to be progressive, it's not becoming conservative, but it's becoming a very particular type of conservative, a more kind of folk libertarian, what we think of like sort of bourgeois liberal politics. So the America First Committee, their primary mode of argument is that going into the war is going to destroy that. It's going to destroy the American. It's going to destroy America's particular political project. And so that's the sort of main mode. However, within the AFC, especially with its biggest spokesman, Charles Lindbergh, there were strains of anti-Semitism and xenophobia that did exist. The organization ran on a franchise model, so different franchises would sort of pop up. So no matter how hard the America First Committee at the leadership level tried to police these things, there's no way that they could do it. And there were more odious actors in America at the time, people like the Boone and the Silver Shirts, who did want non-intervention, but not for the same reasons that the America First Committee did, right? These are people who were true, fellow travelers with fascism overseas. But just the fact that you had some of these tenuous ideological connections in the form of anti-Semitism and just a shared goal, which is to stay out of the war, it becomes inescapable for the America First Committee not to be associated with fascism overseas. And the interventionists played up these connections. Right? They amplified them on purpose to show that, oh wait, rather than don't listen to the AFC's arguments about American governance and wanting to protect democracy. They're really just a bunch of sleeper cells, and if not, they're doing their work for them. I mean, the America First Committee, in all of its documents, it says like, we don't want Bundists, we don't want fascists, we don't want communists. America first, right? We are Americanists. But those tenuous connections and the active effort of the interventionist lobby to amplify them ultimately stained not only their group, but also just any of the ideas of non-interventionism from the right, any notion of American particularism, or the rootedness of the American experience becomes tainted overseas because of these very, very tenuous connections with fascism. And so coming out of the war, going into the war, what had been a overwhelmingly bipartisan, non-ideological consensus on America's involvement in foreign wars becomes shattered. People like Felix Morley, who was a freelance journalist, was fired from his position, or he left. Oswald Garrison Villard, who was one of the members of the America First Committee, who was also a member of the Anti-Imperialist League, also one of the co-founders of the NAACP, very hardly, some reactionary. He was fired from his job at The Nation. John T. Flynn was fired from New Republic. So the liberal aspects of non-interventionism fade away with World War II, and then from there on out, isolationism becomes associated with conservatism because the ideological landscape shifts around them.
I think that this, the kind of the modern rhyming parallel in a way that immediately comes to mind was the efforts behind this Rage Against the War Machine. I don't know how familiar you are with it or what your opinion on it is, but it just sounds, not that, because it's not. The Rage Against the War Machine did bring or attempt to bring together a bunch of people who are opposed to, American intervention in Ukraine. Not all conservatives, some conservatives, the libertarians being, I guess, more representative of the conservative side. But you have this same kind of dynamic at play in a sense where you have a coalition. In some sense, there might be some members of that coalition who, although they didn't express it at the rally, might be more in favor of a BRICS world order. Not that they would condone or support necessarily Putin's invasion of Russia, but from the interventionists, you have trying to exploit those, firstly, ideological differences, but also paint them all with the same broad brush of being people who are in favor, saying that, you don the anti-war garb, but in a sense, you're not. You're pro-war. Joe Walsh just told this to Angela McArdle in an interview just on his podcast just recently. So with that, the theme context is key, trying to look back and see what we can learn from previous iterations of this and apply it to today. That's just the parallel that I identify.
Yeah. And it's also, it's an effective tactic to get to create ideological homogeneity in your opponent. So, what more popular historians or critics of the America First Committee, both now and in the past, they didn't recognize that even though it was overwhelmingly conservative and also in some instance liberal, there were a lot of progressives that were a member of the America First Committee. The Lafayette family, or the Lafayette family from Wisconsin, was big into it. He brought his magazine with him called The Progressive. They would run anti-war periodicals from conservatives and liberals in their magazine all the way up through the war. Human Events, which, believe it or not, used to be a non-interventionist periodical, they ran op-eds by Norman Thomas, an avowed socialist. So there was far more. It was a far bigger landscape than the zeitgeist would hold, and it's because in a large part people left the movement because of these more tenuous connections, right? This is there was active human effort in order to create these ideas in people's minds.
I guess in to dovetail earlier earlier in this interview when you were talking about the America First Committee, you did make the comment, if I'm remembering right, that of that movement, the ones who were more progressive were the ones who were more ideologically opposed to interventionism. Or is that a correct, true statement?
Yeah, I'd say so. Either progressive or liberal. There were some overlaps there, but I think the progressive and then some of the liberals had a far more strident view of the political economy than, say, people like Robert E. Wood or some of the more conservative, like Robert McCormick of the Chicago Tribune was a far more nationalistic person than, say, John T. Flynn, and he would have been and was far more comfortable with a strong military for the purposes of national defense. Like Gerald Nye, who was died in the wool progressive, he dragged his feet on defense spending all the way up to like Pearl Harbor. But some of the more conservative elements of the non-interventionist coalition, both in America First and outside of it, were far more comfortable with defense spending for the purposes of defense. Of course, it wasn't called defense spending; it was called naval or the War Department at the time. So that has been a problem in the coalition going all the way back to before World War II, right? Like how much defense do we want, and like what effects is this going to have on the domestic political economy? And I think the old progressives, the old Midwestern progressives and liberals were far more attuned to the more corrosive effects on the political economy and on the society in general of mass mobilization. Not that there weren't conservative voices who also had their own views, but by and large, the blocks kind of lined up that way. And you can argue, and some have, that like that is the nose in the camel's tent, right? Like once you first say, okay, right, we'll prepare. Okay, well now you create incentives, and there's a whole material argument here that a lot of libertarian economists are fond of making.
Yeah, and I think I mean to highlight the kind of the modern differences that amongst this, I guess you could call it Rage Against the War Machine coalition attempts to build. I mean, just it seems to me that principled progressives who are anti-imperialists, some of the arguments they make is, well, we could take all the money that's been spent in Ukraine and spend it here on social programs instead. But of course, I mean, which I mean, I guess I would rather have it do that than blowing people up or, towing the line with World War III. But on the other hand, I mean, you also have what I liken to is this anti-imperialist, this idea of being against imperialism as a principle, which if that's, I mean, I'm not an expert on what more progressive anti-war folks believe, and I should have more of them on the show, but it seems like to me, it's not as much, I mean, maybe there's a moral component, like a morality component to it, but at least from libertarianism, I mean, we can articulate it pretty well that it's, if you subscribe to the non-aggression principle, there's the whole aggression aspect of it, but there's also war is the health of the state, kind of the old Randolph Bourne sentiment as well. But I guess what I kind of get at is just a personal armchair observation, is that people who don themselves as anti-imperialists on the progressive side tend to know the issues a bit better and get a bit more technical on those issues and have a larger library of facts and familiarity with the subject matter. Of course, not compared necessarily to someone like a Scott Horton and people who I hang out with and surround myself with. But just in generally speaking, I've made that notice that it seems like progressive anti-war activists are very knowledgeable on the subject matter, as opposed to maybe conservatives are more just like, well, I don't know exactly, but I don't like what's happening and I want it to stop, basically.
Yeah, the anti-war left is far more in touch with its history, I think, than the anti-war right, because there was a conscious effort to destroy those connections in the 1960s, right?
Sure.
I mean, these are the stories that we're all pretty familiar with in these circles, right? William F. Buckley going after Rothbard and the Birchers and all that. The anti-war left is interesting because people don't realize, and this irks me every time I have an interaction with like a conservative anon on Twitter, is that they think the left is monolithic.
Sure. Yeah.
And they don't realize that the left has been split on this issue of imperialism or internationalism going all the way back to World War I, right? The rather famous Randolph Bourne, John Dewey split, right? Where Dewey and Wilson, the people in that orbit, they see war and imperialism as a means to create a collectivized domestic economy, right? But Bourne and Adams see this as like morally abhorrent. They're far more sort of cosmopolitan in their views of the human condition. So I think like the left is that's the split going all the way back to World War I. But I think one of the things that keeps the factions divided is where does it start? Right? Is the American imperial desire something just like it's in our DNA? Is it just this? Is it built on race? Is the very nature of capitalism imperialistic?
Right.
I think this is one of the problems in maintaining a coalition, because some anti-war progressives see any exchange between people who aren't equal as being like oppressive, right? Like the very act of trade is so it's difficult because I think the origin story makes policy different, and I think a lot of sort of minarchist libertarians or conservatives would say that like this is a political project, this is a political problem, that things are going just hunky dory until the Spanish-American War or World War I or World War II, and that's where things went off the rails. And whether or not that's true, I think that provides people with a story. It provides them with a narrative, right? If you tell them that their country has, and will always be imperialistic because of either, material capital interests or, American racism, I mean, good luck selling that politically. But, again, I don't know, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But if you tell them that there were certain political decisions that had been made in the past 120 years that can be reversed, then at least you have a means of like creating policy, hopefully. Right?
Yeah.
Who knows that perhaps the horses are already out of the barn. But
well, as a trial attorney, I think I'm primarily interested in narrative warfare because I mean, I've always learned, and it's always been said to me, that whoever tells the best story in a trial is who wins. And I think that, unfortunately to this point, the people who have constructed the narrative are telling a more compelling story than we are. And I'm not saying you should lie, but I'm saying, if you assemble the facts in a way that is compelling and engaging, and sometimes, the details of those facts are a bit more boring and mundane than a fanciful, fictionalized recounting. But I wanted to ask you too, because I don't know very much about this, about kind of the McCarthyism, and aside from just making a statement that I live in Wisconsin, I'm from Wisconsin, my grandfather was in the John Birch Society, which to my knowledge started in Appleton, Wisconsin. But you also have Joseph McCarthy in being from Wisconsin, and how do those two figures, like the John Birch Society and McCarthyism, relate to each other?
Yeah, so the Birchers are interesting because they straddle the old right and the new right. They maintain a deep skepticism, to put it lightly, of like the UN and supranational organizations. They opposed foreign aid. In the early days, they opposed American involvement in Vietnam. People forget that.
Yeah.
But they were later sort of roped into it by the kind of the rally around the flag effect. So in that sense, they were kind of old right, but they had a much more, they believed, in the perniciousness of communism, internationally, and it's a sort of domestic problem. I think we sort of all know that story. So for me, my interest in the Birchers is those continuities, but it's also how they were used as a bludgeon to police the rest of the right. And one of the things I sort of argue in some of my work is that, because of what's been called the Second Brown Scare, the last sinews that tied conservatism back to its pre-World War II, even pre-World War I ideology are cut because the Birchers become so toxic, because, Robert Welch calling Eisenhower, remember the communist conspiracy, it's probably a stretch. And so how McCarthy and McCarthyism tie in is interesting because, he's taken over, the entire image of anti-communism in America, right? But he jumped into something that was already underway. And one of the interesting things for me is looking about how much the second Red Scare is payback for the first Brown Scare. I mean, not to justify it, but many of its early architects were people within the America First Committee, or I guess by now they were alums of the America First Committee. And there's all kinds of correspondence between a journalist who we talked about briefly, John T. Flynn, Robert Wood, who was the former head of the FC, a senator named Carl Munt, and then a representative with last name Dies, is his first name, currently escapes me. But the Dies committee originally was tasked to look at both right and left-wing extremism. Martin Dies, that's it. So Dies had been, in a sense, brown baited for a while. People accused him of being a fascist. He got a little pissed about this. And he got into contact with John T. Flynn, who also wanted revenge for what he believed to be his mistreatment on the eve of World War II. So you can argue, as others have, and as I do as well, that some of the origins of McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare are boomerang or payback for the earlier Brown Scare. And unfortunately, this is kind of one of these instances in which these people are hoisted by their own petard, right? There were left-wing voices going into the early Cold War, some of them associated with communism, some of them just more adjacent, to use that word that I hate, with communism. But they opposed the Marshall Plan, they opposed conscription, they opposed NATO, like many of the things that people on the right did before World War II. But they were drummed out of politics in part because of the Second Red Scare and the very real presence of communist agents within the United States. So there's something of a tragedy here, right? Like once this cycle starts in World War II, it just can't stop, right? Because then you have the second Red Scare, but then you roll right into the second Brown Scare, right? And Kennedy and his whole missile gap nonsense. This is a lie, well, whether or not he believed it is debatable. But people forget that Kennedy ran to the right of Nixon on foreign policy, in part because they wanted to pay back for McCarthyism. I'm sorry, of Nixon, right? Yeah. So once we roll into the 60s now, it's payback again. So it's just this unfortunate cycle. I think it's just part of politics and human psychology that it seems difficult to break.
Yeah, it does. And again, like how far back in the cycle do you go? Can you trace it as well? I guess like the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is not the beginning of the story, of course, but when you have, all those mutually, the war guarantees, and it kind of, the ball gets rolling downhill, and then, with the Treaty of Versailles, and then just kind of setting up the rise of National Socialism. In hindsight, I guess you identify it that way. But yeah, it's like, that's just another example of these patterns going on. And you wonder too, because in a way, the payback from the first Brown Scare seems like, in a way, like blowback, if you could, maybe I could fashion it roughly that way. But I always wonder, we saw blowback from in the terror wars, but now with this sending all these weapons to Ukraine and creating, maybe someday the Ukrainian nationalists are going to realize that they were played the fool and used as a proxy force and let out to die. And what's going to happen when their kids, these fatherless children, grow up, and the surviving veterans from the Ukrainian nationalists have all these weapons floating around in Ukraine. I mean, I don't know what the end game is in Ukraine. That's the $1 trillion question. But what's going to happen once they come of age and realize they were played? So all these cycles happening.
Yeah, it's tragic because every once in a while I'll post something on Twitter like a quote or something from one of these so-called ultra-right people who were perhaps a little kooky, but darn it, they were right sometimes. And there was just this notion that there was this guy named Dan Smoot who I've been studying a lot, and he had this newsletter about like the horrible tragedy it was that the United States had in effect armed both the Indians and the Pakistanis in all of their various wars, and how just awful this is. And it's like, it's difficult to see how these cycles can be broken when the political class doesn't have the incentives to break them. Right. and I think this goes back to one of the earlier points we talked about, is just like where is the political avenue for dissent to flow? And in the absence of sectional politics and those earlier models in America, it's difficult to see where it can go next in order to break them. And I think, it's also because we're like in the wake of World War II, because of the horrors of National Socialism, we have this reflexive disdain for anything like particular or Americanist, or like even the idea of sovereignty itself has been made radioactive. I know that is a controversial topic in itself in libertarian circles, but like how do you unspool that narrative of World War II without going to the dark side? Like some people have over the decades. I'm thinking Elmer Barnes with Holocaust denial, or Stephen Martin. So it's difficult, and I think it's going to take. I hope it doesn't take a complete collapse. I have a kid, so
yeah,
I don't want.
No kidding.
I don't want Mad Max.
Yeah, and I think with all that, it's just like you want to. Because the beginning of the American, never mind. I was going to say the beginning of American exceptionalism seems like the modern American exceptionalism you can trace back to World War II and that myth. And it's such the strongest, deeply held conviction that any American has about history or national sense of pride is that we were the good guys in World War II. And yeah, like you say, how do you unspool that without, getting to some of the more particulars about it, going to some dark areas with Holocaust denial and things like that, or just controversial areas. But yeah, and I wanted to say again too, with my comment about Ukrainian nationalists, there's so much of it that also dovetails into what you're talking about, and we're talking about with Cold War politics and using embedded fascist nationalist elements in the old Soviet bloc as agents of the U.S. Foreign policy agenda too, and talking about cycles going back there, because you can't talk about modern Ukrainian nationalism without mentioning that involvement as well during the Cold War. So it's just it's interesting. So
yeah, interesting and depressing. It's
yeah. Well, anyways, I think we're at about an hour here. I think it's a good place to kind of put in a bookend as well. But so maybe I'll ask you the dreaded question of, when is your dissertation due?
As I say, you never ask a woman her age, a man how much she makes, or a PhD student, how's the dissertation going? So God willing, it'll be done a year.
Okay.
About 9 months from now. I have like 85,000 words. I have the better part of 6 chapters written. So yeah, probably about 9 months to a year, if all goes according to plan. So
yeah, well, excellent. It's like I just came out with that Oppenheimer documentary, and I was talking to James Corbett about it, and he's like, all right, Patrick, well, I ask you the dreaded question of, when is part 2 coming out? And I'm questioning, like, why did I serialize it again? Oh, because it never would have gotten done unless I just put out what I had. And you don't have that luxury of just being like, well, I have the first half of it, so let's just put that out, and then you're under a gun here. So well, you have a website, don't you, where people can find all of your writings in one place?
I do. It's brandanpbuck.com, all one word. That's Brandan spelled with an A, Brandan. You can thank my dad for that confusion.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can if you follow me on the website, you can find links to all of my op-eds and articles, as well as some blog posts and stuff that I put up every now and again, as well as links to previous appearances of podcasts like this. And if you're still on that hell site known as Twitter or X or whatever the hell we're calling it right now, you can follow me on Brandan_Buck.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks for submitting your articles to the Libertarian Institute. I know we really appreciate it and enjoy it. And I hope this isn't the last time that we speak. But thanks for coming on, Brandan.
Thank you.